Geoffroi de Charny was born around 1306 into a Burgundian noble family. He was the third son of Jean de Charny, lord of the fortress of Charny, and Margaret de Joinville, a descendant of the famed chronicler of King Louis IX. From childhood, he heard stories of the Crusades and aspired to emulate their sacred heroism. He grew up steeped in the chivalric culture of his day, learning courtly manners as a boy and training in arms. But he knew that, as a younger son with only modest means, he would have to win his place through deeds of arms and service. He spent his youth training in his father's fortress at Charny and in neighbouring castles. He likely served as a young squire under a senior knight at court, learning the finer points of swordplay and horsemanship. He kept faith with the church throughout. Even as a boy, he attended mass and learned his prayers. In these ways, the foundations of his knightly character were laid. As a young knight, Charny found that his path was not smooth. He married twice, first to Jeanne de Toucy in 1336, which brought him the small estate of Pierre-Pertuis, and later to Jeanne de Vergy, by whom he had a son, Geoffroi II, and a daughter, Charlotte. Through the first marriage he acquired the castle of Pierre-Pertuis and a household income, though he remained far from wealthy. Jeanne de Toucy died around 1342, without children. Charny later took his second wife, and by her sired his heirs. He also competed frequently as a jouster in tournaments, meeting knights from Burgundy, Brittany, and even English nobles. At one famous tournament in Paris, he was said to have captured 3 opponents on the first day, winning their horses and armour. Each victory in the lists brought him honour and the money needed to maintain his household and pay ransoms. These early years set Charny on the road to fame. He began to make a name for himself through skill and courage, even while he remained a humble vassal of no great inheritance. Rising through tournaments and early wars. By his mid-20s, Charny was already leading a small band of armed men into battle. When the 100 Years' War broke out in 1337, he rode to Gascony, the English-held southwest of France, with a troop of squires and knights under the French banner. He also fought in the wars in Flanders and in the Breton War of Succession. In 1340, he took part in the defence of Tournai, helping to lift its siege. By 1342, he was at the siege of Vannes in Brittany, trying to break the English hold on that town. These wars hardened him for what was to come. Later in 1342, at the Battle of Morlaix in Brittany, Charny led a valiant cavalry charge. The English, hiding longbowmen in ambush, decimated the charging French. Charny was wounded and taken prisoner by the English. He was carried off to Goodrich Castle in England and held for ransom. The French crown eventually raised the funds because Charny's life was deemed worth a king's ransom. This experience only steeled his resolve. He returned to France by early 1343 and joined the army once more. He did not fight at the famous Battle of Crécy in 1346, when King Edward III of England destroyed the French army, but he did see its aftermath. In 1347, he helped relieve the siege of Bethune, aiding King Philip VI's forces as they drove the English away. That same year, King Philip sent him on a diplomatic mission. During Edward's siege of Calais, Charny was sent under truce to parley with the English king. In 1349, he took part in a daring attempt to infiltrate Calais by bribery. That attempt failed, and he was again captured by the English. This time, John II, who had succeeded Philip on the French throne, raised a huge ransom, 12,000 gold écus, in 1351 to secure Charny's release. These repeated captivity and ransoms showed how precious he had become to France. Charny's exploits in war were matched by his success in tournaments. In tournament lists at Paris and elsewhere, he often performed brilliantly, capturing prize pennons and ransom money. Knights recalled that he always fought honourably. If an opponent yielded by dismounting or raising a finger, Charny spared him. His reputation as a gentleman of the lists grew even as the war between kings intensified. By the late 1340s, Charny was firmly established at court as a distinguished knight of proven courage, zeal, and courtesy. Service to kings and the Oriflamme. Charny's courage and skill soon earned royal favour. He became a trusted knight of the realm. He was present at King John II's coronation in 1351, riding close to the throne as one of the king's chamber knights. He attended councils and often advised on military strategy. Most notably, King Philip VI and later King John II entrusted him with the Oriflamme, the sacred banner of France. The Oriflamme, once kept at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, was a symbol of royal power and divine justice. When it was carried in battle, it meant that all present would fight to the death, no quarter given. Carrying that banner was a tremendous honour and a burden, for it made the bearer an immediate target. Charny bore the Oriflamme with resolute pride and courage. In the field, he wore his armour polished bright and emblazoned with his heraldic colours. He often rode beneath the Oriflamme at the head of the French charge. Chroniclers praised him as a model of knightly conduct, noting his probity and noble bearing. The English historian Froissart would later write that Charny conducted himself as a prince in war. So great was his presence among the soldiery. He fought in the front ranks of royal armies, visibly loyal under the king's emblem. Under King John II, he continued to carry the Oriflamme on every campaign. John and his nobles came to rely on him, not only as a standard-bearer, but as a steadfast counsellor in the king's war council. Even as France's situation grew grim, Charny's personal courage never wavered. He often wore a white surcoat with a red cross, a symbol of crusading zeal, and even carried a prayer book into battle, showing his deep piety. The Company of the Star and Chivalric Ideals. In 1351, King John II instituted a new chivalric order, the Company of the Star, to bind France's knights by oaths of honour. Only about 100 of the realm's bravest knights were chosen. At the Grand Chapter in Saint-Ouen, each knight swore oaths to uphold the old code of chivalry. Charny was among the founding members. The company was intended to meet at least twice a year in ceremony, much like England's Order of the Garter. One famous rule was that no knight should retreat more than 2 spear lengths on the battlefield until all was lost. Charny's role went beyond ceremony. King John commissioned him to write the rulebook for this order. Charny composed a book of questions on tournament and warfare, and a book of chivalry. The latter was attributed to him, though it may have been finished by his son. In these works, he put forth the ideals he practiced. He taught that a true knight must be brave in battle, but also devout in faith and gentle in conduct. He stressed mercy. A knight should never slay an opponent who has surrendered, and should not shed blood unnecessarily. He said it was more virtuous to spare a penitent foe than to strike him down in cold blood. Charny also stressed humility. A knight should never boast beyond what honour required, nor seek glory at the expense of justice. Off the battlefield, he advised knights to live simply, keep faith with their king and family, and be true to their word. Above all, he believed a knight fought under the sign of God. The true knight must defend the church, protect pilgrims and widows, and see war as a last resort in a just cause. These ideals guided everything Charny did. At the company's gatherings and tournaments, Charny appeared in full harness and reminded younger knights of their duties. He lectured on courtesy toward women and mercy toward foes, urging that knights bear themselves with dignity. In private, he also contributed to the church and charity. In 1353, he founded a collegiate church at Lire, near Troyes, endowing it with canons. He planned it as the Charny family chapel and mausoleum. Charny himself had built a crypt beneath the choir for his eventual burial, and he ensured that priests would say masses continually for the souls of his family. This shows how he balanced piety with prestige. Even as a warrior, he made preparation for death and the afterlife. Through the company and his writings, Charny sought to rekindle the knightly spirit of France. He believed it would carry the kingdom through the challenges to come. Charny's chivalric philosophy. Charny believed that knighthood was a moral as well as martial calling. He often wrote that the greatest victory a knight could win was over himself, to conquer pride, fear, and wrath. He insisted that the code of chivalry, mercy, honour, piety, and truth must guide a knight, even in the chaos of battle. In his writings, he gave practical advice. A true knight should never kill an opponent who has surrendered. and should not shed blood unnecessarily. He said it was more virtuous to spare a penitent foe than to strike him down out of anger. He believed that negotiating with a defeated enemy was honorable, and that even on the battlefield, a knight's conscience must be his guide. Charny also stressed humility. He taught that a knight should never boast of his deeds beyond what honor required, nor treat the innocent harshly. He advised that off the battlefield, a knight should live simply and uphold his promises to lord and family. Above all, Charny believed a true knight fought under the sign of God. He should defend the church, protect pilgrims and the weak, and remember that war was meant to enforce justice, not to sow terror. These ideals were the measure by which he judged himself and others. In the midst of brutal warfare, Charny held to this chivalric vision, even when others doubted whether it still applied. The 100 Years' War and the rival kings. By the mid-1350s, the stakes of the 100 Years' War were higher than ever. For over 15 years, England and France had clashed over royal succession and lands. King Edward III of England claimed the French crown through his mother, and English armies had won bloody victories on French soil. The English won naval supremacy at Sluys in 1340 and devastated Normandy at Crécy in 1346. In 1347, Calais fell after a lengthy siege, giving Edward a permanent foothold in France. France's royal house was shaken by plague and battle losses. Philip VI died in 1350, and his son John II took the throne. Both kingdoms were exhausted by war, but neither king would accept defeat. The two sides began to prepare for a decisive confrontation. France summoned knights from Normandy, Brittany, Champagne, Burgundy, and beyond, even mustering a contingent of Scots who honoured an old alliance. John II collected a mighty army in the provinces. Across the Channel, King Edward and his son Edward, the Black Prince, gathered a more compact but experienced force, including longbowmen from Wales and Gascon men-at-arms. Both kings desired a breakthrough. For Geoffroi de Charny, now a veteran of 15 years of war, this coming campaign would be the culmination of his life's duty. The Black Prince's raid and French response. In the summer of 1355, Edward the Black Prince took the offensive. Leading some 9,000 mounted troops out of Aquitaine, he embarked on a great chevauchée. English and Gascon soldiers rode eastward across southwest France. Towns were sacked, villages burned, churches looted, and towns were compelled to pay protection money. The prince's army, seasoned and well supplied, moved with startling speed. For example, after one clash at Saint-Pierre d'Angoulême, they looted the cathedral's treasury and even carried off relics. This act outraged the French and stiffened their resolve. King John swore vengeance against those heretics who had defiled the church. Meanwhile, King John II gathered his own army. By early 1356, John had assembled a force perhaps twice the size of the prince's, knights from every duchy, noblemen from each county, crossbowmen from Lorraine and the Scots. By March, the French host was on the move north. The two armies played a tense game of cat and mouse. The prince's men kept on the march through rivers and forests, always just out of reach of the larger French army. The French pursued aggressively, but found the English slipping away. The countryside around Poitou and Berry was stripped bare of supplies by the English. The French were frustrated that they could not force battle on their own terms. The English plan was clear: strike, plunder, and avoid getting trapped by numbers. The French plan was to intercept the raiders and annihilate them. After months of manoeuvring, both sides converged near the town of Poitiers. On the morning of September 19, 1356, a calm mist lay over the fields. The armies readied themselves for battle. The stage was set for a showdown, the Battle of Poitiers. For Geoffroi de Charny, the morning of Poitiers was both destiny and duty. Mist still clung to the ground as he rode to the battlefield, leading a company of Burgundian knights. He took his place at the front of the French army, bearing the Oriflamme, France's sacred standard, high above his head. Charny was in the 3rd French Division, under Marshal Philippe de Clermont, which was given the task of launching the main assault. He raised the oriflamme at the head of the knights as they moved into position. The French advanced in dense formation, banners fluttering and lances level, horses' hooves thundering. Many were about 50 yards from the English when King John II finally gave the order to attack. Charny led the charge under that same banner. French knights, swathed in plate armour, surged forward across the open fields toward the English line, but the position was strong. Edward's men had dismounted on a gentle slope just beyond a hedge and moat, bristling with pointed stakes. As the French cavalry approached, Welsh longbowmen and Genoese crossbowmen loosed a deadly storm of arrows. Horses reared, and knights fell as shafts found gaps in even the finest armour. The leading ranks dropped men and standards, momentarily checked by the arrows. Wave after wave of French assault struck the bristling English formation, but each time the knights were repelled at great cost. The French commanders had expected to break the English with sheer weight, but instead, each column was decimated bit by bit. Charny's own division suffered heavy losses as soon as it came within range. Charny himself fought in the thick of the action, urging men forward and inspiring them with his example. He saw King John II and the Dauphin Charles on the king's right flank, and he cried out to the king, "Sire, do not throw your men against the bows." King John, resolute in person, merely replied, "Knights, today we win honour in France," and pressed on. Charny brandished his sword and shield, engaging multiple foes. He was reported to have struck down several enemies, sometimes wresting a banner from their grasp before another could intervene. He offered mercy to those who yielded on the spot, consistent with his beliefs, while cutting down those who fought on. Around midday, a lull came. The French lancers, so heavily armoured, were taking horrendous casualties. Many of Charny's men lay wounded or dead. Yet he held the Oriflamme upright, a beacon to rally around. By late afternoon, the tide decisively turned. A reserve of English cavalry under Sir Robert Knowles swept out from a copse on the French flank. The French believed they were being outflanked on all sides. Panic erupted among the tired men. Duke Philip of Burgundy's division began to falter, and some of the king's younger sons, leading an advance, were forced to flee. Word spread quickly that the king's army was collapsing. Many French knights, afraid of annihilation, turned and rode away. Through it all, Charny stood firm. He gathered the handful of men still loyal around the Oriflamme for a final desperate stand. Surrounded by enemies on all sides and knowing that the French line had broken, he fought on until the end. According to some accounts, he wrapped the torn oriflamme around his lance and fought to protect it. Surrounded, wounded by arrows and sword blows, he continued to repel attackers until he himself was struck down. Geoffroi de Charny fell on the field of Poitiers, defending his king and the ideals he served until his last breath. Defeat and sacrifice. The Battle of Poitiers was a crushing disaster for France. King John II was wounded and captured by the English. Thousands of French knights lay dead or were taken prisoner. Only a few hundred English were lost. The French losses were catastrophic. Among the dead lay Charny himself, long esteemed as one of France's finest knights. Charny's body was eventually recovered from the field and given a modest burial at a Franciscan convent near Poitiers. His death was mourned as a great loss. So many valiant knights had fallen, including 80 of the Knights of the Star, that the defeat shattered France's finest hopes for chivalric revival. Even in that day of darkness, however, Charny's personal example shone. He had fought to the very last sword thrust, defending the banner he carried and the king he served. When news reached Paris and Troyes, people knelt in prayer for the soul of Sir Charny the Valiant. In subsequent years, bards and chroniclers told of Sir Charny as the paragon of knightly honour. Even English accounts later paid tribute to him. One chronicler noted that he had died like a true knight, honourably. In the moment of France's ruin, Charny became the embodiment of the chivalry he had long championed, aftermath and legacy. In the tumultuous years following Poitiers, war and politics continued to devastate France. King John II, remained a prisoner in England for 4 years. The Dauphin Charles, future Charles V, struggled to hold the kingdom together against raiding knights and peasant revolts. The Jacquerie of 1358, a raging peasant uprising against the nobility, was in part an outgrowth of anger over Poitiers. National morale was shattered. In France's royal council, some nobles blamed poor leadership for the defeat. Others pointed to the bravery of men like Charny, arguing they had done all that valor could do. Charny's body was eventually transferred to Paris in 1363 as a sign of honor. King Charles V later had him interred in the prestigious Royal Church of the Celestines in Paris. This was against Charny's own wish to be buried in his church at Lire among priests, but it showed the king's esteem. Philip of Burgundy, John II's brother, ordered that Charny's helm and sword be displayed above the tomb as relics of valor. The Church of the Celestines, long since demolished, preserved Charny's funeral effigy and crest for generations. Charny left behind no direct heirs with his name, but his legacy lived on in many ways. His surviving son, Geoffroi II, inherited his lands and even wore his father's armor into battle once. Charny's writings on chivalry and war circulated widely. His Book of Chivalry, or Livre de Geoffroi de Charny, was read by generations of knights as a code of honor. In it, he argued that courage, loyalty, and mercy are the core of knighthood. Truth and honor never perish, he declared, and he had proven those words by his deeds. Contemporary chroniclers praised him in glowing terms. The Burgundian chronicler Froissart, even as an English-favouring writer, noted that Charny conducted himself as a king on the battlefield and called him the worthiest and most valiant of knights. In France, he was seen as the epitome of knightly virtue. In later centuries, when the grand castles and chivalric codes of the Middle Ages were romanticized, Charny's example was often cited. By the time of Charles VII, the calligraphers at the Royal Library copied Charny's crest and motto into illuminated manuscripts of great knights.